Hello everyone, and welcome to our February event in the Development and Photography Ethics series. For those of you who don't know, we host monthly public webinars on conversations on the ethics of photography and development work. Today we're delighted to host Dr Maru Mormina to discuss how we can actively engage in fairer and more equitable North-South research partnerships. Welcome, Maru.
Hi, Catherine.
And I'll just talk you through two upcoming events that we have as well. So in March, we'll be hosting Professor Gillian Rose, who is the head of the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, about the different global understandings of ethics in relation to visual methods in research. And in April, we'll be hosting Jonathan Hyams, who is the senior multimedia producer at Save the Children, who will be talking about the ethics of photography in the humanitarian and development sector. So my name's Dr. Catherine Gresham, and I'm co-hosting this series with Elise Chotard. And please do email Elise if you would like to join our mailing list. So Elise and I work in the Reach Water International Research Programme at the University of Oxford. I'm a researcher and Elise is a communications expert and photographer. And we have a very keen interest in working as ethically as possible. A hugely important part of our work is our collaboration with our research partners in Africa and Asia. So it's really exciting that we're going to be having a discussion about that today. So just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Maru Mormina. Maru is a senior research and global research ethics advisor at the University of Oxford. She's highly experienced in supporting projects, partnerships, and organizations to recognize and resolve ethical dilemmas, particularly if working in international development. Maru's main research interests lie in the ethics of knowledge production. And before joining academia, she worked in the non-profit sector in Latin America as the project manager of an education and development NGO. So she has a very relevant and diverse career history, which really helps with understanding these ethical issues in international development. So Maru and I have recorded our conversation, and first we're going to play it, which will take around 35 minutes, and then we're going to go into a live Q&A. So please do post any questions for Maru that you have in the chat, and she will be answering them live once the conversation is finished. Hello, Maru. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I just wanted to start off by asking you to set the scene and talk a little bit about why we're having this conversation today. I mean, how common are North-South research partnerships and why are they so important?
Well, I think we need to start by saying that people have been working and collaborating across border for a long time. So partnership is what science is about. You know, the idea of a lone researcher, you know, finding the truth about the world is not how science works. So we work with others, we work in partnerships. So it has been, I mean, international partnerships is part of doing science. But I think it's probably in the last maybe 2 decades that these research collaborations between scientists, research groups, research institutions from the North and from the South have really kind of boomed. Part of this is because of the prominence of the Millennium Development Goals and later the Sustainable Development Goals that have put development really on the map. And also the recognition that the world faces global challenges and that these global challenges, because they are global, they need to be tackled also globally. So we need to collaborate across border if we are going to tackle things like climate change. So And COVID-19 now is really a case in point, right? So this has kind of sparked or has accelerated research across borders, I think, particularly within the field of development. In the case of the UK specifically, in the last 5 or 6 years, there has been also a big push to international collaborations or North-South collaborations. And this is thanks to schemes like the Global Challenges Research Fund, GCRF, which was launched in 2015 to really harness the research expertise that there is in this country to tackle pressing development problems. So lots of people have reoriented their research programs towards working on development programs. And because one of the conditions for accessing GCRF funding is that the research is done in collaboration with those who have a real knowledge of these problems, i.e. those in the developing countries, then these North-South partnerships have really, really proliferated. I think overall this is a positive thing. It's really good to see that more and more research is done in collaboration with partners across the world, but there's always a downside, and we can talk about that too later.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the thing is that we live in an unequal world, right? So trying to navigate these partnerships in a fair and equal way is quite challenging. Yeah, I know you've been quite involved with the GCRF and particularly sort of examining the ethics around some of the development work that happens within the GCRF. And I was wondering if you can just tell me a bit about what is your perception of the current state of equity and fairness in North-South research partnerships as they stand?
It's difficult to say because it's neither all good, neither all bad. I'd say that as a research community, as a global research community, we have made a lot of progress. If I think of how research was conducted in, say, the 80s or the 90s, or even the early 2000s, a lot of these collaborations, these North-South collaborations, were really inequitable. And in fact, they were labeled as, vampire research, parachute research, because the approach was a very extractive approach to research. So just to give you an example, everybody would be familiar with the Human Genome Project that started in the 90s and concluded with the publication of the Human Genome in 2003. But parallel to this Human Genome Project, there was another project that ran alongside that was called the Human Genome Diversity Project. And this project aimed to harness or to create a catalogue of genetic diversity around the world. So it was led by, I can't remember what were the institutions leading this project, but were some of the most prestigious institutions in the US. And what they were trying to do was to map genetic diversity particularly in some of the most endangered ethnic communities. So those small ethnic communities who are at a risk of disappearing. So they were going around and looking, trying to collect samples, blood samples from indigenous populations from Africa, Asia, from around the world. And in many cases, they just went in, collected the sample, went back to their labs, analyzed the results, published everything without acknowledging the communities, without acknowledging the local people who had facilitated that research, etc., etc. So lots of people called out these practices as outright exploitation. I mean, and the Human Genome Diversity Project wasn't the only one. There were other projects. So most projects follow this pattern of very exploitative research, using local researchers as little more than, I don't know, research assistants, or making them help with, the mundane task, or the low skill task, whereas, all the most kind of intellectually intensive tasks were done by the researchers from the global north. So most of these partnerships 20 or 30 years ago followed this pattern, and rightly so. They were called out as exploitative, and I think that led to a rise in a huge literature around the ethics of North-South collaborations. So it was put really very high up on the agenda. Nowadays, no one would think about doing research in this way. But the fact that we're here in 2021, still talking about fairness and equity, suggests that there is a problem. There is still a problem. I think that unfairness is a little bit less overt than it was before. I don't think there is the same level of, outright exploitation, but I think in subtle ways the inequities and the unfairness continue, and we have still some way to go to overcome it.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you talk about that exploitative history of extractive research and the term parachute researcher. I always love that term. It's such a vision of someone just sort of flying in and pulling something out that they want, and then taking it away and benefiting from it. Can you give us any other examples of the way that inequities and unfairness sort of manifests in North-South partnerships now?
I think a lot of it, okay, I think researchers are a lot more sensitive to issues of equity. So I genuinely think that a researcher going into a collaboration today will be more attentive to issues of equity. The main problem, I think, is with the system. We have to do research within a system that foster inequity. So to give you an example, which lots of people are talking about, and lots of people have raised the question of grant management and financial management of grants. So the rules of most research funders are such that the main kind of financial responsibility for the grant lies with the partner from the global north, and it's really, really difficult to kind of take a very equitable approach, a very equal approach to managing a project when you have kind of financial power distributed so inequitably. So that's one example of current inequities. Of course, there's still the question of authorship. There's still a dearth of authors, or first authors from developing countries. I don't like using the word developing countries, but just a shorthand, let's use it. But yes, authorship is another example. So there's still lots of inequities in publication, in approaches to publication. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's the case that whoever controls the money has a lot of power within these relationships.
Well, yes, I think there is a question of power behind financial arrangements, because the partner that has the power, that has the money, is the partner that makes the decisions. There's also the fact that there's a lot of kind of intellectual inequalities. So I have heard from researchers who kind of need to put together a proposal for a grant application, for example. They need a partner from developing countries, and it really becomes a scramble for finding suitable partners in African countries or Asian countries, and because there are deadlines, and usually these deadlines are very kind of tight. What ends up happening is that the country from the UK ends up writing the grant, kind of writing up the proposal, and then kind of trying to bring partners in just because they need a partner from a developing country. Whereas, if you were to do this properly, I think there should be a longer consultation, a longer kind of process of engagement where partners come together, discuss their respective interests, their respective priorities. And this is something that has been discussed at the level of funders quite a lot, actually, that funders should have or should provide a funding for partnership building. So normally a funder will fund a project, but behind that project, there is a relationship that takes an awful lot of time to build. So, and I think funders are coming round to recognize that they need to fund, they need to support that process of relationship building, because that is fundamental. And without that relationship, then it is impossible to have an equitable partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also shapes who gets funding in developing countries, which partners get selected to work on these huge international research programs and receive these large amount of money. If there isn't enough time to sort of foster those partnerships, then it might end up with the same people going back to the same partners over and over again.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happens. That I always say that a partnership is a little bit like a marriage. So you really need to get along, and you really need to trust each other. So a partnership can be very successful, or really can go pear-shaped within months. And because it's such a close relationship, and there is so much at stake, you really want to make sure that the people you work with are people you trust, are people that that you're sure you're going to work well together. So unfortunately, this means that you always end up going back to the same people, and this creates inequities within the countries themselves. So it further kind of exacerbates inequities, because those that are usually those who are well connected, who have the possibility to go to international conferences, who have the opportunity to network internationally. So your collaborators tend to be those people, or your kind of country collaborators tend to be those people who are already well connected. So, and I think there is that this is also something that is being discussed with funders, that how can we expand the pool of partners? How can we make sure that we tap onto all of the talent that there is, and not always go back to the same people. Now, there are issues. So, for example, you've got language barriers, you've got internet connection barriers. So connecting and building these relationships across continents, across time zones, across languages is not easy. But I think there is a recognition that we need to work a bit harder and just try to move away from the usual suspects.
Yeah, really interesting set of challenges there, and a few sort of barriers that we can work on. What do you think are sort of the main barriers to moving towards more equity and fairness? And you mentioned that the funders, there's avenues that they can go down to try and support more equitable and fair partnerships. Do you think there are any other actors that really sort of need to reflect on their practices?
Look, I think there are, as far as I can see, there are three main barriers. The first barrier, and I speak here as someone who's kind of working in a more philosophical environment, is that the first barrier is that I don't think we're clear about what we mean by equity and fairness. I think different people have different understandings of what these terms means. And this despite the fact that there is a deluge of literature and guidance on equitable partnerships. And perhaps that's the problem, that there is so much guidance that and there isn't a kind of a common definition, a common understanding of fairness. The second problem, I think, and I mentioned this before, is the system itself. I think apart from the conditions attached to grants or to funding, I think that the system, the research systems within which we work, and I talk here mainly about countries like the UK, the US, Europe. These systems, these research systems, favor competition over collaboration. So we have a research culture that measures researchers against researchers. For example, through measures like H factors, how much grants, publications, how much grants you win, etc., etc. And I think this breeds unethical behaviors. It pits us against each other. So the system is a barrier to collaboration, and it's not just the collaborations between kind of North and South, but also kind of collaborations between colleagues in the same institution, in the same country, in the same region. So we have a research culture where that favors competition over collaboration. The third barrier, I think, is how we define excellence. Now, fundamental to equitable partnership is having parity of esteem, is regarding our partners in, as much as we regard ourselves. So the concept of excellence, the idea of what it means to be a good researcher, is determined by all these measures. So how many publications you have, where do you publish, where do you work, how many conferences you're invited to speak to, etc., etc. And therefore, these are measures that are very Western-centric. So if you go to countries in other countries, in countries outside the West, these measures don't mean exactly the same, don't don't measure quality in the same way. So we measure quality in a very kind of Western-centric way. And therefore, it's very difficult to have parity of esteem when we are measuring researchers, our partners in developing countries according to the standards of the West. And I think this is a fundamental barrier to equitable collaborations, unless we start recognizing that excellence is also in these countries, that excellent research is also being carried out in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in Bolivia, in, I don't know, Sri Lanka, that it might not conform to the standards of excellence that we in the North uphold. Then unless we do that, I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress with equity within partnerships. So I definitely think that, you know, parity of esteem is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I love the idea of that parity of esteem. It's such a neat little way to think about it, and for us to reflect on our own practices and the way that we regard our colleagues. And yes, really great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that also leads on really nicely to actually have a little chat about a recent conversation piece that you wrote that was about how much Western countries can learn from developing countries about managing the COVID pandemic. So
yes,
a little bit about that article, because I feel that idea of parity of esteem and measuring how we measure excellence really underpins that article.
Indeed it does. So I, for the last year, I co-hosted a seminar series with SOAS. And then it was a seminar series on different aspects of research for development. And the aim was to share lessons and good practice among those involved in development-oriented research. So then the COVID pandemic hit, and we had to start all working from home. So we couldn't run these seminars. So we decided to kind of reorient the series to an online format, to a webinar, but also to look at some aspects of development-oriented research in connection with COVID-19. So what are the impacts of the pandemic on development research, but also what opportunities the pandemic opened up for researchers doing development research. So one of the things that I really wanted to do was to look a little bit at what the North can learn from countries from the Global South with experience of past pandemics. So I thought, well, Ebola will certainly be, a very kind of relevant example to learn from. So we ran this webinar, and what became pretty evident during the webinar and also during conversations I had with the speakers afterwards is that there were a lot of lessons to learn from smaller, poorer countries, and yet government, the media, all of us were not looking at those countries. So we were constantly looking and comparing ourselves against other kind of developed countries. So if you remember, press coverage about how well New Zealand was doing, how well Germany was doing. So we decided to run this piece in the conversation with this colleague who spoke at a webinar. So he wrote the experience of Nigeria and the African Union. I researched cases from Asia and Latin America, and what we found was that there were lots of lessons to be learned, as we explain in the article. And yet, what we also found is that when commentators including some very highly regarded scientists, refer to the success of these countries, particularly Africa, at controlling the pandemic. They explain the success of these countries in terms of kind of deterministic, they give deterministic explanations. Things like, well, they have, you know, some genetic protection, they have younger populations, therefore they're not so badly affected, their lifestyle, they had exposure to other pathogens that might confer them cross-immunity against COVID, etc., etc. So we kind of raised all this in our article, and we asked, why are we not able to see and to learn the good lessons that developing countries have to teach? And we came up with this conclusion that, again, is a little bit of hubris, a little bit of kind of arrogance. We are accustomed to see the global south, where we're used to see developing countries as the location of problems, not the location of solutions. So when we think of the developing world, we think of problems that need to be fixed, not lessons to be learned. So we are used to othering them. So, you know, well, okay, we can't learn lessons from Africa because, you know, they're not like us. Their social, economic, and political context is different. So the lessons are not transferable. So in a way, I think this is the same arrogance that prevents northern partners from recognizing the capacity that is already there in their southern partners, and that lead us to impose our own standard and conceptions of excellence that I was talking about before.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this superiority complex and this very elitist attitude that you see mirrored in these North-South research partnerships as well. So I want to ask you a bit of a challenging question, because we obviously both work for the University of Oxford, but the University of Oxford is regarded as one of the most elite institutions in the entire world. So what would you say to someone who said that in terms of moving towards more fair research partnerships, that Oxford University is actually part of the problem rather than part of the solution? How would you respond to that?
I'd say it's part of the problem in as much as the rest of the research machinery of the global north is a problem. Perhaps Oxford, having, you know, the standing it has a greater responsibility to redress some of these imbalances. Imbalances from which it has historically benefited. So there is a greater responsibility. I'm not sure if you know, it has a greater role in the problem, but certainly there is a responsibility. What I see, and again, I like to return to this kind of theme of hubris, of arrogance. I see a bit of arrogance at the institutional level, but also at the individual level. So we live in a kind of meritocratic society where we like to think that we are in the position we are in because we've earned it, because we've deserved it, because we've worked hard, because we're smart, and therefore we deserve to be where we are. And I think this hampers an honest recognition of the problem, and it prevents us from identifying solutions. And it clearly prevents equitable collaboration. So if you start your collaborations from a position of superiority, there's, you know, there isn't a very optimistic prospect for you know, good collaborations. I need to recognize that there are lots of good intentions and good initiatives within Oxford that aim to address some of these inequities that we've been talking about in the distribution of research capacity, etc. So, for example, many large programs that are hosted by Oxford have kind of dedicated work packages for things like capacity building. And also the institution does fund some long-term initiatives that promote equitable collaborations, particularly between Africa and Oxford. But all these good initiatives and all these good intentions always and inevitably intertwined with the economic and reputational interests of the institution. And therefore, in my view, they perhaps don't go as far as they could go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads me on quite nicely to our last question, which is to anyone in the audience who may be about to embark on a North-South research collaboration. What do you think are your 3 key takeaway messages for moving towards more equitable and ethical collaboration?
Yes, we all like about, for some reason, we all like number 3.
Yeah.
So 3 take-on messages. Okay, 3 take-ons. Well, I think the first one has to be that you can't aspire to fairness, however you want to define fairness, without equal recognition. So parity of esteem, I think, has to be the first one. So don't aim at equity or equality or just aim at have parity of esteem, at recognizing your collaborator as a worthwhile professional. If you do this, you'll be able to see that your partner has a lot to teach you. Don't be fooled by whatever standards of quality that we are measured by ourselves, the so-called key performance indicators. So the fact that your collaborator hasn't published in Science doesn't make him or her a less competent researcher. The fact that your collaborator hasn't attended so many international conferences perhaps doesn't make him or her less a good researcher. So focus on what is there, focus on what they can bring to the collaboration, on not what you can bring or what you be ready to learn. So that's one. The second one, I think, is once you've established this mutual recognition of skills and talents, you need to engage in dialogue. Do you know what your partner wants, or your prospective partner wants to get out of this collaboration? Do you know what skills they want to use or what skills they want to develop? Do you know how they want you to help them, or how they want you to play your part? So be humble, be open, and engage in this dialogue. It is really important. I always like to compare a partnership with a marriage. So open dialogue is absolutely essential. So try to find out what they want, how they see the collaboration, what they want to get out of it, what are their motivations, and build from there. And I think one more would be ready to challenge the system. So as I said before, the system is kind of foster inequity in grant management, financial management, etc. So be ready to challenge this system. If you are receiving funding from an organization, or from one of the research councils, go back to them and say, you know, what can we do? How can we work, you know, in a more equitable way? Is there any kind of wiggle room within the rules to, you know, make kind of different financial arrangements? Be ready to challenge the system. Yes, that would be my three messages.
That's wonderful, Maru. Thank you so much for joining me today. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been great talking to you.
Maru, thank you so much for those really interesting insights. It's so great to have such an honest conversation about this, because, you know, there are so many collaborations all over the place, and as you mentioned, so many barriers and things we need to be thinking about. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to dive straight into the Q&A, and I'm going to start off with the first question that says, do you think that open access policies for publishing may improve the situation in terms of accessing the findings of research conducted in the Global South?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and the honest answer is I don't know. I think open access makes research available, and that is a great thing. That we remove barriers for researchers to access and build upon research. I'm not sure it does much to you know, promote or foster more research from the Global South. And I think that is the problem. The problem is that we still have too much research about the Global South conducted in the Global North. And I don't know to what extent an open access policy is going to kind of redress that imbalance. So yes, I think it's good to have an open access policy, but it still doesn't address the question of, you know, why is it that there isn't more research coming out from the Global South in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, related to that question, we've got another one here saying, when will we see research outputs disseminated in Indigenous languages? I often see researchers conducting research in Africa without speaking even one African language, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having this conversation with a colleague of mine who's a decolonial scholar, and he was complaining about the hegemony of the English language. And I said, well, do you know, if we don't have a common language, then how can we collaborate? How can we kind of build upon each other's knowledge? So you really need, and the fact that it's English, that common language, is, you know, an accident of history, perhaps, you know, whatever kind of horrible histories behind the preeminence of the English language. The fact is that that's where we are now. Now, having said that, I totally take this point that research needs to be useful, and it needs to be useful to the people who contributed to the research. And there is a lot of research that it's not just a question of language, or important as it is, but it's the fact that even those who understand English sometimes can't access the research because it's just written in such an arcane kind of terminology. So we do need to make research more accessible. Publishing in local languages, yes, absolutely. I think it's really important. It would be great to disrupt the monopoly of the big publishing journals by giving more kind of importance and more profile to smaller journals, local journals. Yes, I think it would be, it is really important, but it's not the only thing. I think alongside with that, I do think that you still need a common language to communicate, to collaborate, to build upon each other. And the fact that that language happens to be English is probably unfortunate, but that's where we are. We're not going to rewrite history. So yes.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good points. I mean, there's so many different challenges and barriers in the publishing, the academic publishing sector. So yeah, I mean, with language just being one of them. We've got a really good question here about standards of excellence. So can you possibly exemplify some cases where you feel that non-Western excellence is overridden by Western perceptions? So this is sort of asking, are there not baselines that cannot fail regardless of differences in cultural perceptions?
Yeah, I think that question comes from David.
Yes.
David, you've you caught me there on a very sloppy, use of the term excellence. Yes, when I talked about excellence, well, the first thing I want to say is that the term excellence itself, it's a term that we all use without really defining it. But the way you find the term excellent being used in the context of funders, for example, in the context of governments, or in the context of institutions, is excellent research is research that has an impact. So almost as a kind of synonymous of impact. So research that is excellent doesn't. I didn't use the term excellent in the sense of the rigor of the methods, but in the way that the term is being used and abused by governments, funders, universities, etc. So it's in this sense that that I use the term excellence, and this is what I think when I had in mind when I said that we need to recognize excellence elsewhere, because the parameters by which we define excellent research in the North is in terms of publications in high impact journals, economic impact, certain addressing the SDGs, for example, so the impact is the development impact of the research, etc., etc. Now, this push for excellence, what it has done, it has made smaller institutions in developing countries kind of try to mirror, try to conform to a model that is the model of the Northern institution. So I started I did my undergraduate degree, and I started my academic career in South America, and I could see back then that the university was kind of trying to position, or universities were trying to position in these international league tables. For what purpose, I don't know, but the fact that they wanted to be part of a league table kind of creates the conditions for certain topics to be researched and certain topics to be kind of left aside, and researchers themselves, they want to kind of play in the international kind of arena. They have to do research in certain topics because those topics are the ones that are of interest to the big journals, and therefore issues that are perhaps more important to the local context kind of get pushed aside. So the question of where you publish. So I have had conversations with people saying, look, you want to promote early career researchers in Africa, and in order to build up their careers, you're kind of encouraging them to publish in high impact journals, etc., etc. Well, if that is if the research is going to have any social benefit, why publishing in a high impact journal that is paywalled, that is inaccessible? going back to the previous question. So why do we define excellence in terms of where you publish? The impact of your research might be much, much bigger if you publish in a local journal, if you publish in the local languages, etc., etc. So it's in this sense that I think that the push for excellence is being harmful to well, not just to the social impact, to the impact of research, but to researchers themselves. So,
yeah, I mean, we did talk about that a little bit, about the different research environments that the researchers live in the different countries, and how much that contributes to expectations around academic research. So thanks for that. Yeah, we've got two questions that are a little bit related. So David Pyle from Earth Sciences has said, how can we influence the structures that hardwire inequities and unfairnesses in grant schemes in UKRI, for example? And then Marina's asked a great question, how can we make sure that that process of building partnerships is acknowledged in academia, especially if the collaboration fails, but a lot of time has been lost from trying to build those new partnerships?
Right. Yeah, these are difficult questions. I think I was talking to a seasoned researcher once, and he was saying how he just does whatever research he wants to do, and he kind of bends the rules of grant, of calls, of funding calls, to kind of fit his research into that funding call, whatever the funding call is. So it takes a little bit of craft, I think, to do that. So I think I would say, with regards to some of these rules, for example, around grant management, there's always an opportunity to work around. I don't want to say, try to find loopholes. It's not that what I want to say, but the rules always allow for some sort of leeway. And I think it's important also, if you do have a grant from UKRI or the research councils, it's important to have this dialogue with the funders. And as I was saying before, to push back a little bit, go back and say, look, this is not working. This is not working for my collaborators. How can we do this? Engage in a constructive dialogue with the funders. We researchers have the tendency to kind of defer to the funders, and whatever the funders say, that's what we have to do. I think they are, in my experience or from what I've seen, they are very open to feedback. They want to hear from researchers. They're a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand they hear researchers and they hear the feedback that we give them. On the other hand, they have the government saying, well, look, we have to do this around due diligence or this or the other. So they're kind of in the middle of it. But I think we need to be able to go back to the funders and say, yes, this is not working. How can we interpret the rules, or how can we change things if this is not working? What was it? The second question was
how to acknowledge that time spent making partnerships.
Well, I think universities need to take need to be a bit less risk averse. All universities. If you think, for example, the Gates Foundation, they fund a lot of research that is high risk, and in the knowledge that maybe 10% of what they fund will work out, and the rest will not work out. Now, if you don't fund 100 projects, you'll never get the 10 that will work. So, and I think this is an understanding that waste in that sense is built into the process. And I think universities need to take a similar approach, that there needs to be a recognition that, yes, you're going to have your people investing X amount of time in building a collaboration, and of those, 300 hours invested, maybe 10 hours were worth something. But without all that investment, you would never get, to an outcome. So I think it's all about risk aversion, and I think institutions need to be a bit less risk averse. Now we can talk at length here about the neo-colonial or the neoliberal model of university management that is so damaging. Everybody is acknowledging that there is a problem in how universities are managed. But, this could take us, another hour.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. We're up to the hour, so I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much, Dr. Maru Mormina. It's been such a wonderful conversation, and thank you all for your questions. And thank you so much for bearing with us with the technical challenges we faced at the beginning of the session. Really appreciate that. And I know that Maru and I are very keen to continue these conversations. So please do feel free to get in touch with us. And do email Elise if you're interested in signing up to our mailing list as well. So, Maru, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure.
Thank you.